Catching Pokemon is a core aspect of the series, and it couldn't be simpler to do. Weaken the Pokemon, throw a ball, pick a god and pray. Sure, you don't need to weaken the Pokemon first, but it'll improve your odds of performing a successful capture, so you might as well.
Oh, it's faulty.
But what if you couldn't weaken the Pokemon first? That'd make things kind of aggravating, right? Enter the Safari Zone. One of the core rules of this place is that when you encounter a wild Pokemon, you can't send out your own Pokemon. Well, most of the time, but we'll get back to that later. Your typical options are to throw a ball, use one of two kinds of items only usable in the Safari Zone, or run away. You also have a step limit and have to pay an admission fee, but not always. Despite being in multiple games, the Safari Zone has received a lot of tweaks and changes in each of its incarnations, so I felt like taking some time to go over each version of the Safari Zone and talk about what makes them unique, along with all of the mechanics these places have, because holy crap, there's a lot under the hood. Starting with Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, we can find the Safari Zone in the north end of Fuchsia City. For 500 Pokédollars, we're granted access until we either run out of the 500 steps we start with, or until we run out of Safari Balls, another constant of the Safari Zones throughout the series. In most games, Safari Balls have the same efficacy as a Great Ball, but in Generation 1 specifically, they're Ultra Ball clones. They have double the catch rate of a regular Pokeball, compared to the 1.5 times multiplier Great Balls have. This change will be important later. In Pokemon Yellow and only Pokemon Yellow, you can actually enter the Safari Zone even if you have less than 500 Pokédollars. You'll just get less Safari Balls than usual, down to a single Safari Ball if you enter with no money. I assume Game Freak did this for precisely one reason: to make sure the player couldn't be locked out of the Surf and Strength HMs. Yes, going through the Safari Zone is mandatory in the Generation 1 games, as you need to get both of those HMs to be able to finish the game. But it's worth it to go through the place for reasons other than getting these HMs. For starters, there are rare Pokemon here that you can't get anywhere else in the game. Tauros, Kangaskhan, Chansey, these are the big prizes, but there are also other exclusive Pokemon like Execute and Rhyhorn. Some prizes in the game corner are also found here: Scyther, Pinsir, and Dratini. You will find more common Pokemon here too, like the Nidorans and Paros, so not every encounter is going to be a rare Pokemon. Chansey in particular is quite notorious for being really difficult to catch. It has a catch rate of 30, the same as Fluttermane, Murkrow, and Chatot, and only 5 more than Snorlax, Mantine, and Skarmory. Tauros and Kangaskhan both have a catch rate of 45, which isn't much better. The difficulty in catching these Safari Zone exclusive Mons is compounded by their dreadfully low encounter rate, usually no higher than 4%. Oh, and the wild Pokemon here can run away from you. The odds of this happening in the Generation 1 games are actually pretty interesting. Basically, the higher the wild Pokemon's speed stat is, the higher the odds they can run away. This makes not only faster species of Pokemon more likely to flee, but also higher level Pokemon as well. Remember, we're talking about the actual speed stat, not the base speed stat. You can also throw bait to make the wild Pokemon less likely to flee at the cost of its catch rate getting halved while it's eating, or throw a rock to double their catch rate, but make them twice as likely to run away while they're angry at you. Now, some of you may be saying, well hold on, Safari Balls have the same efficacy as Ultra Balls in Gen 1, so these Pokemon are easier than ever to catch in the Safari Zone, to which I say you're wrong. I told you that change would be important later. Much like a lot of stuff in Gen 1, trying to catch a Pokemon doesn't work the same as it does in later games. In the context of trying to catch Chansey, Kangaskhan, and Tauros in the Safari Zone, a Great Ball would actually be nearly 2 times more effective than a Safari Ball, despite the Safari Ball increasing the catch rate more than a Great Ball in Gen 1. Very basically, if a Pokemon has a low catch rate, it has at least 50% of its max HP, and it's not suffering from a status condition, A Great Ball will provide better odds at capturing the Pokemon than an Ultra Ball or Safari Ball. Thanks, Gen 1! And while we're talking about Gen 1's coding, it turns out there's a glitch that completely removes the need to test your luck catching Pokemon in the Safari Zone. And I'm not talking about the Mew glitch. If you enter and exit the Safari Zone and then immediately fly to Cinnabar Island and surf along the eastern edge of the island, you'll encounter the Pokemon that you can find in the tall grass in the Safari Zone. Very basically, the reason this works is because the game looks at the bottom left part of a tile to determine which encounter table to pull from. Because the bottom left parts of these tiles directly next to Cinnabar Island contain land, and you're on a tile that can generate wild encounters, the game assumes you're on a tall grass tile. The game only updates the tall grass encounter table when you enter an area with tall grass encounters. So because Cinnabar doesn't have a tall grass encounter table, the game is still using the Safari Zone tall grass encounter table. One last aspect of the Kanto Safari Zone that I want to talk about is the rest houses. In each of the Safari Zone's areas, you'll find a rest house that contains a couple of NPCs. These are a waste of your valuable steps, don't go in them. However, if you do go inside, there are a couple of interesting NPCs. One of them talks about how she was going to meet her boyfriend here, and actually has a name, Sarah. Most NPCs like this don't get named, so that's pretty neat. But also, you can find her boyfriend, Eric, outside of the Safari Zone, saying they were supposed to meet up there. In other words, there was some misunderstanding when the two were talking to each other, and as a result, they're waiting for each other in different locations. The Japanese version contains a similar idea, but uses wordplay that wouldn't make sense in English, so their dialogue got slightly tweaked in localization. Another noteworthy NPC mentions how there are a lot of items in the Safari Zone, but you'll run out of steps if you try to get all of them in one go. Bulbapedia mentions that if you enter the Safari Zone after beating Koga and bring along a Pokemon that can learn Surf, you are able to get all of the items in one go. I never heard anyone mention this before, though, so I tried it myself, and sure enough, I grabbed the last item with plenty of steps to spare. This includes the single hidden item, a revive found in front of the building where you can get the Surf HM. Speaking of hidden items, if you use the item finder in the entrance to the Safari Zone, it'll say there's a hidden item nearby. Unfortunately, the player can never get to this item, meaning it's unobtainable without cheating. For the record, the unobtainable item is a nugget. Moving on to Gold, Silver, and Crystal, the Johto region has no Safari Zone in these games. Upon exploring Kanto in the post-game, when we reach Fuchsia City, we discover that the Safari Zone there is closed. It wouldn't be until Heart Gold and Soul Silver that the Johto games get a playable Safari Zone, but we'll go over it later. The Hoenn games bring back the Safari Zone, and with it come a couple of changes. When you enter the Safari Zone, located on Route 121, you'll be denied entry if you don't have a Pokéblock case on you. In Emerald specifically, you get the Pokéblock case in Lilycove City, which is after the Safari Zone's location. Ruby and Sapphire have the Pokéblock case in Slateport City, as that's where you can first do contests in those versions, one of the few advantages Ruby and Sapphire have over Emerald. Once we're able to enter the Safari Zone, like in Kanto, there are multiple different areas we can explore for items and rare Pokemon. Using this image from Bulbapedia as a handy guide, Areas 1 and 2 are always accessible, while Areas 3 and 4 require the Mach Bike and Acro Bike respectively. Areas 5 and 6 don't require a bike, but are locked off until you defeat the champion. They're also only in Emerald. Ruby and Sapphire players only have Areas 1 through 4. In terms of Pokemon available here, this is probably one of the more disappointing Safari Zones in my opinion. Players with the Acro Bike can get Heracross in Area 4, while Mach Bike users get Pinsir in Area 3. Those two mons are pretty cool. Other than those two, however, Girafarig? Pikachu is exclusive to the Safari Zone in Hoenn, which is honestly kind of hilarious, but also surprising. You're telling me the series mascot is only found in the Safari Zone in this region? I don't know, that doesn't feel right to me. Phanpy and Wobbuffet are probably the only other noteworthy Pokemon here. Phanpy's exclusively found here, and Wobbuffet can only be found as a Wynaut from an egg in Lava Ridge or on Mirage Island. You know, one of, if not the rarest thing to find in the entire series. Natu and Doduo, along with their evolutions, can also be exclusively found here, but this lineup still feels kind of lame to me outside of Heracross and Pinsir. It's definitely not the worst lineup of Pokemon, though. We'll get there. If you're playing Emerald, Areas 5 and 6 are home to various species of Pokemon from the Johto region, including most of the Pokemon that were supposed to appear in Altering Cave, but never did due to the events for the cave never happening. There are other Pokemon here too, including Miltank, Gligar, Snubbull, and one of the most powerful Pokemon in existence, Sunkern. At this point, you may be wondering why you need a Pokéblock case to get into Hoenn's Safari Zone. Instead of being able to throw bait or rocks at the Pokemon like in Kanto's Safari Zone, here we can either go near the Pokemon or throw a Pokéblock. There are also Pokéblock feeders in each of the areas of the Safari Zone, which allow you to manipulate the natures of the wild Pokemon nearby. Specifically, for the next 100 steps, 80% of your encounters near the Pokéblock feeder will have a nature that enjoys the taste of whatever Pokéblock you put in there. Now, since there are multiple natures that like each of the 5 flavors a Pokéblock can have, you would probably assume each nature has an equal chance of appearing. No, of course not, this is Game Freak we're talking about. Instead of each nature having the same chance to appear, the odds are weighted so that natures that are further down this list are more likely to spawn than natures higher up on the list. For example, if you throw in a red Pokéblock, the Naughty nature is most likely to be on a Pokemon, followed by Adamant, then Brave, then Lonely. Because the Hardy nature both likes and dislikes red Pokéblocks, wild Pokemon won't be more likely to have that nature. You can also throw a Pokéblock to a wild Pokemon once you've encountered them. This lets you decrease the chance they run away while keeping their catch rate the exact same. In fact, with some shenanigans and a bit of luck, you can make it possible for a Pokemon to become unable to run away. Meanwhile, Go Near, the other option you can select, increases your chance of catching the Pokemon, but also increases the chance they run away. You can go near multiple times to further increase the chance you catch them, but the boost you get to the catch rate gets smaller and smaller each time you do it. Meanwhile, the chance of the Pokemon running away goes up the same amount every time you go near, meaning this option gives the player diminishing returns in terms of helpfulness. There's one more fun quirk with the Safari Zone, and that's the introduction of a catch factor for each of the Pokemon you can catch here. What is a catch factor? It makes the Pokemon harder to catch. Okay, there's a little more to it than that, but that's the short version. The long version involves math. Don't worry, it's not that bad. Basically, the Pokemon's catch rate is divided by 12.75 to obtain the catch factor. This number is then rounded down to the nearest whole number. Once any changes have been made to it, the catch factor is then multiplied by 12.75, then rounded down to get the modified catch rate. Because we're rounding down, this means even though we're multiplying by the same amount we divided by, any given Pokemon's catch rate will be lower than usual if we didn't boost the catch factor in some way. In other words, selecting Go Near at least once. The exception is if the Pokemon's catch rate was initially either 255 or lower than 12.75. The former because 255 divided by 12.75 equals a whole number. The latter because the rest of this equation is saying, if catch rate divided by 12.75 is less than 1, make the solution 1 instead. Let's just take a moment to let that sink in. Game Freak made an area where Pokemon are inherently harder to catch because you can't weaken them or give them a status condition. Then, they made the catch rates of Pokemon encountered specifically in that area worse than if they were encountered in literally any other place in the game. There's also a flee factor introduced, which always starts at 3 and gets multiplied by 5 to determine the percentage chance a Pokemon has to flee any given turn. Going closer to the Pokemon always increases the flee factor by 4, or a flat 20% increase to the odds of running away, and throwing a Pokéblock can reduce the flee factor by a varying amount, depending on how much the Pokemon likes the Pokéblock and how many you've thrown to that Pokemon. Finally, there's a single rest house in this Safari Zone located in Area 2. Just like in Area 1, this building is completely useless. And unlike Gen 1, there's not even any fun NPC dialogue. Before heading to the DS entries, we need to make a quick pit stop in Fire Red and Leaf Green. While the Safari Zone is fairly similar to how it was in Red, Blue, and Yellow, there are a few changes we should go over. The first and probably most obvious change is that the step limit has been increased from 500 to 600. Considering this is the only Safari Zone to have a step limit of 600, and it's also the only mandatory Safari Zone, I'm going to assume this was done to make getting the Surf and Strengthening gems easier. Just like in Red, Blue, and Yellow, you're still able to get all of the items in one trip, assuming you come in after beating Koga and bring a Pokemon that can learn Surf, even with the addition of this Quick Claw. The more noteworthy change here is the return of the catch factor from the Hoenn Safari Zone, along with an expanded flea factor. The flea factor now works a bit like the catch factor. Each Pokemon has their own base flea rate, which is divided by 12.75 and rounded down to determine the flea factor. One last step is, if the Pokemon is in an angry state from having a rock thrown at it, the flea factor gets doubled, while if the Pokemon is eating bait, the flea factor gets divided again by 4, rounded down if necessary. Just like Hoenn, the flea factor is then multiplied by 5 to determine the percent chance a Pokemon will flee that turn. There's one more tidbit about the catch factor. Similar to Gen 1, if you throw bait at a Pokemon, the catch factor gets halved, while throwing a rock will double the catch factor, in addition to the flea factor alterations. Well, there's one more thing. Throwing bait can't bring a Pokemon's catch factor to below 3. This means if a Pokemon's catch factor is normally 3 or less, then there's no downside to throwing bait. And there just so happens to be 7 Pokemon for which this is the case, including Chansey, whose catch factor is normally just 2. This means throwing bait actually increases Chansey's catch rate while it's eating, while also reducing the chance of it fleeing from 45% per turn to just 10%. The one downside is that the game determines whether a Pokemon will flee before you throw bait or a rock, meaning the first turn you encounter a Chansey, you'll always have a 45% chance of it fleeing before the boosted catch factor and lowered flee factor kick in. Fellow YouTuber Professor Rex talks about this topic in much greater detail, and includes a chart showing the optimal actions to take per turn to boost your odds of catching not only Chansey, but lots of other Safari Zone Pokemon with a low catch rate and a high flee rate. He also has a similar video for Hoenn Safari Zone. I'll throw a link to both videos in the description. Oh, yeah, Game Freak also removed the unobtainable hidden item at the entrance. Oh no, whatever will I do? In Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, no place called the Safari Zone exists, but we have a functionally similar place called the Great Marsh, located in Pastoria City. Pay a fee, get Safari Balls, get annoyed you can't catch stuff, run out of steps, be sad. The biggest difference here is probably everybody's least favorite thing about the Sinnoh region, if not one of their least favorite things. The Marsh Tiles. Certain marsh tiles, when you step on them, will cause the player to sink down and become trapped until you mash on the D-pad enough to free yourself. You don't lose any steps trying to become unstuck, but it's still extremely annoying and interrupts the experience. It is easier to tell which tiles will cause you to sink in Platinum compared to Diamond and Pearl, but that's really only part of the problem. In Diamond and Pearl only, you also get the Defog HM from the Great Marsh, but not only is Defog optional, it's given to you by an NPC right at the start of the Great Marsh, meaning you don't have to fumble your way through the place to get it. In Platinum, this guy gives a random shard each day, which helps out in paying for move tutors. As for battles and the Pokemon you can find... Bibarel? Really? Bibarel? Wooper? I can find you or your evolutions in the route right outside Pastoria. You're not special. There are a surprising number of Pokemon here that just are weird choices for a Safari Zone. Sure, every Safari Zone has those, but it feels like the Great Marsh takes that to another level. Platinum fixes this a bit, but Diamond and Pearl also have Starly, Budew, and Azurill appear. Why? I don't know how much of a hot take this is, but I look at the Pokemon the Great Marsh has and just feel underwhelmed. Combine that with the Marsh Tiles... I think the Great Marsh is easily the worst of the Safari Zones. But still, there are some neat aspects to the place. You can head up to the second floor and look through the binoculars to see what Pokemon can be found where. This does cost 100 Pokédollars, but every day there will be a Pokemon randomly added into the Great Marsh, and the binoculars can show you which Pokemon this is and which area they're in. Keyword being can, as you're not guaranteed to see this daily Pokemon, and prior to getting the National Pokédex, some of the Pokemon the game can choose from are already in the Great Marsh. Still, if you're interested in completing the Pokédex, you might want to keep an eye out for Carnivine, as it's a Pokemon that only appears in the Great Marsh when it's chosen from this pool of Pokemon that can appear in the binoculars. I think about the only other noteworthy thing here is the other options you can select in an encounter, Bait and Mud. Don't use them. Okay, like, according to Bulbapedia, there's no Pokemon in the Great Marsh that benefits from having either Mud or Bait thrown at it. Your best bet for catching literally any Pokemon is just throwing Safari Balls. But in the interest of being thorough, throwing Bait always increases the Pokemon's catch rate by 1 stage, and has a 90% chance to increase the Pokemon's chance to run away by a stage. Mud does the exact opposite. It always decreases the escape rate by 1 stage, and has a 90% chance to decrease the catch rate by 1 stage. These stages work just like stat stages. Values increase and decrease by the same values per stage, and you can't go higher than +6 or -6 stages. The catch factor and flee factor from Generation 3's Safari Zone seem to be gone, thankfully, but instead we get absolutely abhorrent flee rates. Almost everything has at least a 23% chance to run away on any given turn, and Croagunk and Kangaskhan both have nearly a 60% chance to run away each turn. That's ridiculous. The only Pokemon with less than a 23% chance to run away is Whiscash, and that's probably unintentional. I think about the only other noteworthy thing is that Platinum players can get a Pokejap from this girl in the lobby if they catch 5 or more Pokemon in a single Safari game. Woo. As I mentioned earlier, Heart Gold and Soul Silver do have a Safari Zone, unlike the original Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Make your way to the newly added Routes 47 and 48, and you can find what's basically a small town that houses the Safari Zone. Unlike other incarnations, you're actually able to edit what your Safari Zone looks like, and you can even share your own Safari Zone with friends. After completing a couple of challenges for Balba, the owner of the Safari Zone, he hands control of the place over to you, and you're able to start changing things up and customizing the areas. These challenges aren't anything too hard, they're more or less just tutorials for the player. The first one has you catching a Geodude, who's a common encounter in the first area, and the second has you catching a Sandshrew, which requires changing out areas using the Area Customizer. Yes, while the Safari Zone can only have 6 areas at one time, there are a total of 12 areas you can choose from for your Safari Zone, each with their own biome and set of encounters. After you complete the second challenge, you're able to change out areas at any time. You also gain the ability to place up to 30 blocks, or objects, inside each of the areas, and here's where things get a bit stupid. So, each of these blocks belongs to one of 5 categories: Plains, Forest, Peak, Waterside, and Other. For the purposes of this video, we don't care about Other, just the first 4 categories. Whenever you place a block from one of those 4 categories, a point gets added to the area that it's placed in. If these points reach certain thresholds, you can encounter additional Pokemon in these areas. Now, remember, you can only place 30 blocks in any area, so that means no Pokemon needs more than 30 points to be encountered, right? You're telling me I need not only 56 peak points to encounter Bronzong in the forest area, but 35 forest points as well? How does that work? If you leave these blocks in an area for a certain number of days, the points these blocks give get multiplied, up to a 7 times multiplier for being in an area for 250 days. That's over 7 months of just waiting. Now, to be fair, if you stay on top of things and change blocks and areas optimally, you only need to wait 110 days to get every additional species in the Safari Zone. That's still kinda bad. You can't even change the system's clock to speed this up. You literally just have to wait. At least you don't need to boot up the game every day for the Safari Zone to realize that days passed, but that's still, at best, almost 4 months of waiting. At least you're able to get some pretty cool Pokemon via this method. Riolu, Chansey if you want to torture yourself, Beldum, Beldum? Yeah, the Pokemon that's kind of notorious for having a catch rate of 3, a catch rate normally reserved for legendary Pokemon. You can encounter it in the Safari Zone, a place where it's harder to catch a Pokemon on account of being unable to weaken them. You're telling me I get to wait 70 days to have the privilege of playing the lottery? Okay, I guess Metang's available after only 30 days in another area, but I'm still convinced these two were added by Game Freak's more sadistic developers. Now don't get me wrong, there are tons of more easily catchable Pokemon available here too. Bidoof, Surskit, Hippopotas. I'll leave a link to the Bulbapedia page on this Safari Zone in the description so you can check it out for yourself, because there has to be at least 100 Pokemon in this place. When it comes to mechanics like catching wild Pokemon and them fleeing from you, most of that stuff is the exact same as the Great Marsh in Sinnoh. This includes the bait and mud not being helpful in catching Pokemon. The only real difference is that you don't have a step limit in the Safari Zone, something that only one other incarnation of the Safari Zone has. After Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the Safari Zone vanished for a bit. It arguably made an appearance in X and Y via the Friend Safari, but it's not quite the same thing in my opinion. The only future games to incorporate a proper Safari Zone were remakes of games that I already covered. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl's Great Marsh is just the same thing as Diamond and Pearls, meaning you get the Defog HM there and a ridiculously bland list of Pokemon to catch. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, however, made some pretty radical changes to the place. Not only did they keep the lack of a step limit from the Heart Gold and Soul Silver Safari Zone, but now there's no entry fee, and wild Pokemon are fought normally. You're able to weaken them and use other kinds of Pokeballs. This version of the Safari Zone basically feels like a glorified route. Sure, it's way more convenient for the player to access the area and catch the Pokemon in here, and that's a good thing, don't get me wrong. However, it comes at the cost of removing everything that made the Safari Zone what it is, other than its name. And then the next time the place makes an appearance, it's the worst Safari Zone of the bunch, fully featured with no improvements. It seems like the concept of the Safari Zone is done for. Heck, even Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, remakes of Pokemon Yellow, completely removed the Safari Zone in favor of the Go Park. To be perfectly honest, I feel like, conceptually, the Safari Zone is fine. Just make the Pokemon easier to catch, or less likely to run away, or even both. Having an area where there's a twist applied to the normal catching formula sounds like a fun idea, especially if there are more exotic Pokemon there. It's just that the execution was always lacking, and when Game Freak tried to fix this, they either didn't tweak the right things, or they overcorrected. Let me know what you think about the Safari Zone in the comments, and hopefully you enjoyed the video and learned something new. A big thank you to Darkmaster Zork, Mithril Monarch, PK Smokey, Sedzi, and Duna Nix, along with the rest of my patrons scrolling by for going the extra mile and financially supporting the channel. See you next time, everyone.